and a very good afternoon. It's just gone 1 o'clock on Monday, the 31st of May, 2021. You are listening to Insight, or indeed watching us if you're watching us on our live streams right now. Very good afternoon to you if you're watching us live or wherever you're listening to us at the moment. It's fantastic to have your company on another episode of Insight this week. Raw 12:51 AM's premiere news show. As I said, quite a lot going on at the moment. I hope we are deep in the middle of exam season at the moment. So I hope wherever you are, wherever you're watching this, I hope your exams are going well. I hope you're managing to look after yourself. I hope that you're giving yourself some well-earned rest. If that's watching Insight, Counting for You is giving you your rest, thank you very much. I really admire you taking the time to watch us and count Raw 12:51 AM as a little bit of rest. I do like that, but I do hope you are looking after yourself at the moment, and you're giving yourself opportunities to do many other things during your exam season. And if you want one fantastic opportunity, why not listen to Raw 12:51 AM when we come back home on June the 7th? Yes, we are back in the studio this time next week. I am really looking forward to being back in the studio. Insight isn't going to be back in the studio just yet, whilst we're hoping to get some more guests on air, but we will be back in the studio hopefully later on. We will have some other news shows going back to the studio as well, and we have a Pride Week special live from the studio. Now that's all going to be coming soon. We'll be putting out a lot more about that soon, but yes, Raw 12:51 AM is back in the studio on June the 7th this time next week, so make sure that you are tuning in to hear us, back where we belong. I know we are all really looking forward to it. But let's move on to today's show. There is a lot for us to get through. We're going to be talking, of course, about some of the biggest stories from last week. Of course, Dominic Cummings' committee appearance, the lessons learned from COVID, a lot. Certainly to discuss there. Certainly a lot that came from Dominic Cummings' statements there. And certainly, fair to say, painted a rather bleak picture of the government's response. So we'll be discussing the ins and outs of Cummings' appearance at the committee. We'll also be talking about the origins of COVID. In particular, last week, Joe Biden sanctioned an investigation from US intelligence into the possibility that the COVID-19 virus was leaked from a lab in China. Now, of course, there's been a lot of debate really centered on this because, of course, Donald Trump suggested that this was a theory throughout a lot of last year and was repeatedly shouted down as being a conspiracy theorist. So we'll be discussing a lot, not just the scientific, but the political implications of this. And we'll be finishing off discussing all the surroundings and all of the goings on surrounding the incident that took place in Belarus last week, where a Ryanair flight carrying a Belarusian dissident was landed in Belarus on a security threat. They said that they reacted to a security threat because of a bomb, but the dissident journalist and his girlfriend were both arrested, and there's been significant international outcry in response to that. So we'll be talking a little bit about that. But firstly, let us welcome our guests onto today's show and start off with a very familiar face here on Insight. It's our former head of news, Enoch Mukungu.
It's good to be back again. I've been back so many times to keep saying that, but it's good to be back.
It's great to have you back. And I must say, you said last week you really enjoyed being on the other end of the lens. How just put it into perspective. Now you've obviously stepped away and I'm the one who's now got to do all the planning. I'm the one who's got to make this an interesting show. Just tell me what it's like to be a guest again.
Oh, well, I mean, last year, Insight's really a good 2-day planning process. Like Sunday, find news stories, get guests. Monday, wake up early to prep the show, and then try and calm any nerves. Whereas today, I woke up at a reasonable time. I made breakfast. I told my flatmates. I was very calm. I logged onto this stream. I've done no work for it. I'm not only my own preparation, but like the general news being done in the past week. It's been very, very relaxed. I've enjoyed that tremendously.
I must say, it's weird. I went onto a sports stream. I went into one of Will's sports streams a few weeks ago back as a guest, and it's so weird now running a department. Going back to doing that, it does feel really weird. Like you just go and you talk about what you think. You don't have to plan anything. You get the questions put to you.
Yeah,
it's a different sort of intensity.
It's like life on easy mode. That's what it is. I've missed it. I'm glad it's back.
Well, it's great to have you back on the show today, Enoch. Let's bring on someone who hasn't been on Insight of late, but he is someone who's used to my presenting, and indeed a former regular on the alternative view. Hopefully for our visual watchers, his internet is going to sort itself out. I believe it has. Odysseus Digbasanis, a very good afternoon to you.
Hello. It's good to be back. I haven't had the time to be back on air so far in term 3. Exams have all been sort of piled towards the beginning. But now, got a bit of time. Happy to be back on. It's been a while.
No, it has been a while. Of course, you were regular on the Alternative View, which, of course, my former show, potentially getting a few reawakenings later. But, of course, it's great to obviously have you on Insight. How are you feeling on a sort of going on from, my old little show to the premiere show now here on Raw?
What can I say? It's an incredible opportunity. I feel blessed to be in the big time show here. Finally, I've made it. It feels like I've made it finally at last. But congratulations again on making Head of News. I'm sure you're going to do a great job. And Enoch, you did a fantastic job. Cannot praise both of you enough.
Well, thank you very much for the vote of confidence there. I feel much appreciated, especially in the middle of exam season right now, where I'm teetering on many verges of sanity. Very appreciated. Thank you very much.
Yeah, don't worry about it. You'll do fine.
As you can see, we've just put on the bottom of the screen. If you're watching us live right now, if you do have any comments or anything we're going to be discussing today, please do leave your opinions. We really like to hear what you have to say. And let's start off with just some of the biggest news that broke from the weekend. I just want my guest's opinion on this quickly. We say Boris Johnson's secret wedding. Now, we've heard in the last week that Boris Johnson had told guests, or a specific number of guests, to release, I say it was 30th of July 2022, to leave the date free, presuming that was for his wedding to his now wife, Carrie Simons, now Carrie Johnson. What we found out was that on Saturday, Boris Johnson had managed to secretly get married in Westminster Cathedral. We say secretly. Apparently, according to Chris Bryant's Twitter, you can't legally have a secret wedding. So Boris Johnson obviously got married at the weekend. A few things from it. Boris Johnson's third wife, now Carrie Simons, also getting married in a Catholic church. I believe it has annulled the previous 2 marriages, whilst also meaning that Boris Johnson is the first Catholic Prime Minister, I believe, in over 200 years, and the first Prime Minister since Lord Liverpool to get married whilst in office. So, just very quickly, both to my guests, what's your reaction to the news of Boris Johnson's wedding? And also, if we're in the mood for a bit of a secret wedding, what would you want at your secret wedding? So, Enoch, let's start off with you.
My actually have no reaction. I took in this news sort of with complete absence of thought, like, oh, Boris Johnson's married now, and I scrolled on with my life, going, wait, Boris Johnson's gotten married in I don't know. It feels like celebrity gossip of the most vacuous kind. It's about someone I should ostensibly care about, but about nothing about him I care about. My real question now is, what's he actually going to be doing in 2022 and that date he saved? What's the new? Obviously, now he's got married. I want to know what he's actually going to be announcing on this special day. I think he's going to announce the rebuilding of the British Empire. That's my first thought. But I'll leave it up to you to decide.
Well, mate, I am intrigued what that date is for. We have heard some people say it's a big wedding reception, hopefully past COVID. Although if we are waiting another year to get past COVID and to have that wedding reception, I must say that's not something I can look forward to, perhaps to another year of these restrictions. Odysseus, if you were having a secret wedding in the style of Boris Johnson, what's the kind of thing you'd be going for?
I don't really know. I haven't really given it much thought, just like Enoch. It just kind of popped across my feed. I'm like, well, would you look at that? Boris Johnson's often gotten married. So yes, I don't know. I guess I'd keep it small. Probably avoid the press, just like Boris, because they'd obviously be all over my wedding. Like, no doubt about that. But who knows what that date is for? Maybe, I don't know, maybe he's planning another wedding. The guy, he's had an interesting romance so far. Who's to say that's to stop?
That would be that'd be a wonderful new record to set. The fast for to get divorced in office as well.
Oh yeah. Well,
but I have one fact about the wedding I want to bring up because I've just read it and it has struck me. The music was provided by the music of the after party was provided by a London acoustic trio, and they played an acoustic cover of Gangster's Paradise.
wait, no
So
way
I've
is that
I've
real.
changed my mind. This is real. I've changed my
Oh.
mind. Boris Johnson's marriage is a blight against this country, and it cannot be allowed to stand. I refuse.
That is amazing.
I-
I haven't heard that. If you are listening to us on Raw, because we air the show on Raw 12:51 a.m. a day after, and you do hear Gangster's Paradise potentially pop up now, as our little musical selection on this show, you'll know why. Thanks for that, Enoch.
I
Oh
can,
my
take, I,
days.
can, I can offer no fact. I mean, honestly, all I can say now is I'm calling the Conservative Party right now to vonk Boris. You cannot have this man be your leader. You cannot put this in other people.
Do you know what? I don't hate it. I don't hate it. I mean, at this point, you know, I'll let it go. Honestly, he's got bigger things to worry about.
Yeah, but it's fair to say Boris Johnson certainly does have bigger things to worry about. Let's move on to one of those bigger things that he now has to worry about. As we said earlier, of course, if you have any opinions on the show, please leave a comment. But let's now move on to, of course, the committee from last week. And as we said, there have been some people that have said that Boris Johnson's secret wedding was perhaps a well-timed distraction from Dominic Cummings' appearance at the joint session of the Health and the Science and Technology Committees last week in Parliament. Now, some of the headlines from that committee include the following. Obviously, Dominic Cummings was talking about his role and the government's COVID pandemic response as part of this kind of idea of trying to learn the lessons from the pandemic. And it's fair to say he painted a pretty bleak picture. Whiteboards that he released on Twitter and discussed in the committee, just outlining the fact that government planning at the start of the pandemic, despite having had Operation Signet, which of course wasn't publicly disclosed at the time, that the government's COVID response was lacking, that there was, according to Dominic Cummings, a groupthink in Whitehall that was restricting plans being made, and just a general set of failures that, according to Dominic Cummings, cost thousands of lives. Dominic Cummings apologised for his role and indeed the government's failings throughout the pandemic, and indeed was particularly critical of a few members of the government. He was critical of the Health Secretary Matt Hancock, seeing him as incompetent, constantly lying, and also the Prime Minister Boris Johnson as well, indeed making the comment that Boris Johnson was unfit to be Prime Minister. Of course, some praise as well within there from Dominic Cummings, in particular reserved for Rishi Sunak, Michael Gove and Dominic Raab for their roles within the pandemic. And also, of course, it was this time last year that Barnard Castle was making the news. An apology from Dominic Cummings over the whole Barnard Castle affair, himself admitting that he personally didn't see his trip to Barnard Castle as something that was problematic, something he said that he didn't see as crazy, but admits looking back probably was. There's a lot that came from that committee. And so I guess let's break that down, because I've kind of run through a very broad overview there. But Enoch, let's start off with you.
Yeah.
What would you say are the most important things that to have been learned, or the most important things to learn from that committee?
I say it's well, I think in terms of genuine useful political there's two major things. And in terms of understanding the inner dynamics of this government and Dominic Cummings' relation to this government, there's three major things. So the two major things are Boris Johnson seems absolutely unfit for the job he's doing, in the opinion of the person who got him elected. And if we can believe Dominic Cummings, the second major thing is Matt Hancock needs to lose his job. Those are the two major things we can take away politically. Now, in terms of the internal dynamics of of this government, first we have to put Dominic Cummings really. The first thing is Dominic Cummings really hates Matt Hancock. I don't know what Matt Hancock did. I don't know if he ran him over one day or he egged his house or something. Dominic Cummings deeply hates Matt Hancock. I think most particularly you can see it when he's happy to give Hancock all the blame, and I admit correctly, if what he's saying is true, absolutely correctly on the care home scandals in the first half of the pandemic, and the testing scandal in the first half of the pandemic. When it comes to talking about the vaccine procurement and also the September lockdown, Matt Hancock, who was by all accounts at the time when it was unpopular, everyone wanted to say Matt Hancock was leading the push for an earlier lockdown in September and leading the push on vaccines. Of course, now they've both shown up to work. Dominic Cummings has nothing to say. The Matt Hancock does not appear at all. The second most interesting thing is, of course, the glorification of Rishi Sunak, even when it's by Dominic Cummings' own accounts, Rishi Sunak is pushing bad policies. I think the most key way you can see this is when he sort of discusses how Boris was being ignorant and pig-headed by not going for September lockdown, but of course Rishi was being very wide-headed and calm by wanting to protect the economy by not going to September lockdown. And the third thing is, and you mentioned that he praised Michael Gove. I think the most interesting thing is he didn't say Michael Gove's name once. Michael Gove was praised by absence. He was given the level of credibility by not being mentioned at all, or being dragged into this whole charade. So I think that all those were the most interesting things about the whole thing to me.
Well, it's important to say, obviously, on the point of Matt Hancock, multiple references to lying regarding testing in care homes, as you mentioned, to setting an arbitrary target on testing that Cummings called irresponsible and potentially worsened the test and trace program. More widely, interestingly, Odysseus, Dominic Cummings seemed to place quite a hard hand on Whitehall, in particular notions of groupthink within Whitehall, seeing the Department of Health as completely unsuited to a pandemic. So I guess the question from that is, when it comes to lessons learned, is it not just elected politicians, but Whitehall and the British political system more widely that needs to have changes as a result of this?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important question, and one I think that Cummings has been sort of tackling with ever since his early days in Downing Street. What the Cummings sort of inquiry evidence giving thing showed is that I think Cummings is a massive enigma. On the one hand, he, as Enoch points out, criticizes the man that he got elected and calls him incompetent. And on the other hand, he wants to reform Whitehall. If you remember, one of the reasons why he left, which I'm not sure was mentioned in his testimony, so it was this idea that he wanted to unite the number 10 and number 11 civil servants teams to sort of form this weird financial political body, which would break convention and sort of to unite number 10 and number 11. But on the civil servants point, I don't think Cummings is right. I think Cummings just wanted to go in there and shake things up. I mean, it's really a lack of political leadership. The civil servants that sort of follow them around, politicians around, are the servants of those politicians. And he's trying to push forward this idea that actually, no, it's the civil service controlling policy. It's not the case. And it's a misconception that's been spread sort of for at least a couple of decades now, with stuff like Yes Minister, Yes Prime Minister as well. Very funny, but also wildly inaccurate. So I don't think Cummings is right. I think this is a crisis almost purely of political dimension, and doesn't call for a sort of systemic change in how the civil service works with government in the way that Cummings wants it to, because Cummings quite literally would very happily toss up hundreds of years of progress on how the civil service works. And that's simply not going to solve anything. It's going to cause more damage than good.
Well, Dominic Cummings made quite a point throughout his time in Downing Street. Of course, in January 2020, before the pandemic, he made a point of seeking to modernise the civil service, employ what he regarded as freaks and weirdos, policy specialists, perhaps outside of the usual civil service mold. But I guess there's a lot more questions that I think could be asked from this. In particular, he presented the sense of the government's sort of early response to the pandemic and the fact that there was literally no response, it seemed, that from the data scientists that were being done and on the discussions of herd immunity. Dominic Cummings said that the discussions of herd immunity were taking place, not because it was the preferred option, but because there was no other option. So I guess, Enoch, coming back to you now, looking ahead, I guess the lessons that could be learned from this, how do you think Cummings' testimony will sort of inform future looks into pandemics, perhaps?
Yeah, I think the first thing we need to understand is that the UK government were not just unprepared for the pandemic, they were also unprepared for one of the kind of philosophies of the early response was that people will not respect restrictions, they will not accept restrictions. We now know is untrue. So first, we have to have a government that's capable of accurately assessing its population and what we're willing to accept and what they're willing to do and sacrifice in order to create, a better health goals for everyone in a serious crisis. But it does help if you start with just having a plan and building a system that is able to respond first at a local level, because I think that's when we saw seeing the big failures here, was that there was no local level response to the first people who were showing symptoms who could be isolated, put into quarantine, and responded and had all the track and trace essentially. But then on a national level, there was no organisation of government. As I think we heard that Boris missed 5 COVID meetings, according to Dominic Cummings, to write a book about Shakespeare. Absolutely absurd. The fact that no one was there to hit the panic button until Helen, I can't remember, Helen McNamara.
Yeah, I believe
Helen
so.
McNamara basically had just walked into government, walked into Downing Street, like, she said a word I can't. Cummings said a word I can't now repeat. On Raw News, but basically just telling them that it's an absolute disaster and something is done now, and to take it seriously, it's baffling to me. And there has to be some major early warning systems built in. And I guess this needs to be. I think that's the overall thing I want to take away. There needs to be more put in place in our government to predict bad things happening and try and act against them preemptively, rather than trying to solve crises after they pop up.
No, and it's interesting as well. Another thing kind of Cummings dawned on when he was talking about his departure from Downing Street was sort of the different political tensions that were arising within Downing Street. And it seems perhaps now going back to the Prime Minister, he presented a Prime Minister that was almost asleep at the wheel at the start of the pandemic, that was willing to get himself injected with COVID, believing that it was something not significant. Of course, Boris Johnson was eventually in intensive care after catching coronavirus. So I guess going back now to Boris Johnson, and perhaps more of a focus on him, Odysseus. Of course, Dominic Cummings has been a controversial figure within British politics over the last few years, but especially the last year. Do you think that, given that controversy that he has, and given quite the harsh critiques that he has made, do you think this is something that's going to resonate with the wider public, or do you think this is something that can be easily dealt with and tackled with by the sort of political spin, perhaps, that has become a part of British politics of late?
I think he's probably getting an easier time at that gaining traction nowadays, but I just think that the general British public still doesn't trust Cummings. He's a slimy figure in that sense. He's a political planner, and he is precisely what I think the British population doesn't like. It has a deep distrust. The Conservatives don't like him for stabbing Boris in the back. Labour certainly doesn't like him because of his policies with the civil service, and with Brexit, of course. That's also a lingering factor with Cummings' involvement in that whole campaign. So I don't think the British public really is willing to accept Dominic Cummings now. I wasn't a particular fan of how Sir Keir Starmer used this whole inquiry to sort of point the finger at Boris. I thought that was severely miscalculated to sort of use Dominic Cummings as someone to prop up his argument against Boris Johnson, which I thought was quite weak, and also really the wrong decision to make, because I think Cummings is probably popular in small circles in Whitehall through his blog and so on, but I genuinely don't think, let's say, if he was running for anything, people would vote for him. I don't think so. I don't think he'd get that many votes.
Well, I personally can't ever see Dominic Cummings ever running for anything. I feel it would almost be a personal anathema to him. Let's just finish this section now, just very quickly. I just want something very quickly from you both. Of course, Matt Hancock is set to appear in front of the committee in a week and a half, where there will be questions about a lot of what Dominic Cummings has said. Of course, the committee asked Dominic Cummings to substantiate a lot of his claims, so it will be interesting to see what comes from that. But I guess, what in terms of the future, in terms of the implications of this appearance, in terms of Matt Hancock, and we know that there is an independent inquiry scheduled now for next year. Just very quickly, starting off with you, Enoch. What, I guess, is the most important development to look out for now with this story?
Most important development, I think, looking at Matt Hancock, most important development is Matt Hancock completely falling apart from the committee, and as he's been doing for the media all week. He clearly has no answer to prepare. I think that has been the most evidence we need that Dominic Cummings is right. And then from there, the question is, does he resign or not? And if he doesn't resign, that's just some seriously bad things by the state of our government. And
Odysseus, what do you agree with Enoch there?
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with him, but I don't think that Hancock would resign, even if Cummings' claims could be substantiated, I think he'd basically pulled the card that it would be more damage to our political landscape and to the nation's recovery from COVID to have a health secretary leave now and to force a transition. And I don't think Boris would allow that. Frankly, I think that the polls are not showing that needs to happen, but we'll see. I frankly don't think much will come out of this Hancock appearance later on, but that's just speculation. I would love to hear him comment on the Spider-Man meme, though. That would really make my day.
I want to know what's Hancock's version of Spider-Man. What meme?
And what's he going to come up with next?
I bet Hancock's a distracted boyfriend guy. That's the kind of memes.
Oh, yeah.
Well, we talk about Matt Hancock and technological prowess, but he does have an app. Of course, the Matt Hancock app is still going. So
is it still up and running?
It is still the Matt Hancock app is still up.
I wish I could have seen how.
If anyone gets that reference,
if anyone gets
I'll buy
that,
you a pint.
Yeah.
If anyone gets that reference, they have immediately shot up in my books.
Yeah.
I really wish I could have seen how the Dominic Cummings experience went on the Matt Hancock app, amongst the hardcore Hancock heads. I wish I could have been there, but.
Although, mind you, just one last thought as we end this section: would Secretary of State Peter Mannion have done a better job at handling the pandemic? We don't know. That would be a great counterfactual.
Probably off having a Twix.
If Armando Iannucci is there listening, I would love to see that. We have to move on though, because there's still quite a lot for us to discuss. Let's move on now to another topic. The origins of COVID. Now, throughout the last year, of course, there's been a lot of debate with regards to the origins of the COVID pandemic. Now, originally, and throughout most of 2020, it had almost become consensus that that COVID came from natural origins, that it started off in a wet food market in Wuhan and was spread throughout the population there. And indeed, many people who were seen to question that theory, including US President Donald Trump, were regarded as conspiracy theorists, were having political motives at the forefront of this, and were very much sort of taken out of the conversation. Now, some developments within the last week. Last week, 3 scientists in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which was known to be investigating bat-borne coronaviruses and cultivating them within the labs, we found out last week that 3 scientists from the institute were hospitalized with COVID-19 in November 2019. And with increased speculation over the potential of the lab leak theory, of course, there was an investigation by the WHO in January that seemed to rule it out, but said there was insufficient evidence being supplied by China to do so. Now, Joe Biden announced last week that he is instructing US intelligence to now reinvestigate the possibility of COVID being leaked from a lab in Wuhan. And we understand British intelligence is also involved. China has continued to deny this. They say that COVID's origins were natural, although there are continued questions concerning the information being supplied. Let's talk to my guests about this, because it seems like it's almost come full circle a little bit on the lab leak theory, where many people who this time last year would have dismissed it as completely implausible are now starting to consider it as a plausible theory. So I guess, Odysseus, let's start off with you now. Do you think this is just a case of, making sure that we're covering every ground before it runs out? Or is this potentially now the lab leak theory becoming possibly the central theory to how COVID started?
No, I don't think it's going to amount to something that important. Primarily because I even, let's say in the far off scenario that it does come out to be true that it came out from a lab or something like that, do you think that China would admit to that openly? I don't think so. I think that perhaps there's something that it's going on that we don't really know about. Perhaps the US is trying to put pressure onto China in some way through pushing for this investigation. But I don't think it has purely to do with the origins of coronavirus. Joe Biden's leading this effort. It's obviously damaging for China to have this rumor still floating around in official circles. And perhaps, even though Joe Biden has denied it and said that it's just a preliminary investigation of international partners who want to collect data and to analyze it more scrupulously. I think this is more about applying pressure to China as a competitor to the United States, where for a long time under the Trump administration, pressure was not really there, or at least definitely not enough of a challenge for Beijing. But now I think it has more to do with the U.S.-China relationship than really the actual origins of the virus. I don't know. Am I cynical in believing that? Maybe, but
well, perhaps maybe to follow on from that, because of course Donald Trump, someone who you could argue was in many ways kind of similarly competitive with China, was pushing this last year and was repeatedly shouted down. And now Joe Biden has said that he's going for the investigation. There doesn't seem to be that same kind of pushback against Biden. So is it political? Was it perhaps more that Donald Trump suggesting it because he was Donald Trump made it worth discrediting? Or is there perhaps more scientific evidence now, given the news we found out last week?
Yeah, I think it's to do with the way that that Biden's proposing it versus the way that Trump proposed it. I mean, you remember Trump kept going on about China virus. I'm not being racist. Let's call it the China virus. Whereas Biden seems to be taking this much more seriously and saying there might be evidence. He's being much more composed about this, much more scientific about this, and less political. So I think it definitely makes a difference that it's Biden who's proposing this in a different way. And that's why also I think he's applying more pressure to China, because China could easily dismiss Trump, knowing that, well, no one outside of America really takes this seriously. But now it's Biden, he's proposing it scientifically. And now I think that's a higher level of pressure for Beijing.
Well, Enoch, I know you said you have something to say on this. Obviously related to that, I guess the political scientific debate on this. What do you got to say on this?
Yeah, I think it's very much only a Nixon go to China moment here for Joe Biden. Donald Trump was simply not someone who's viewed as credible. I mean, this is touch this. Donald Trump was not someone who could be viewed as credible speaking about COVID. And also, it's a combination. He was sending very mixed messages early last year. COVID wasn't a big deal, but also it's caused by China in an evil virus leak decided to kill all of us. But also, it doesn't matter, so don't wear a mask. Whereas I think Joe Biden, who is very much like COVID's real, take it seriously, but also we have to investigate all the causes of it, is a much more credible figure. But it also has to be said, over the last year, we see increasing evidence that COVID was present more, why I say more widely, I mean more widely within Wuhan in particular, than we thought when it was first found in December of 2019. We've seen some, I think there's at least one report about traces of COVID being found from store samples as early as September. So I think there's been a lot of queries asked about, when exactly COVID started, and over the timeline there quite makes sense. So I think this investigation is needed. But this is right. This is really mostly a way of America apply pressure on China in a way they couldn't really before.
Well, it's interesting, of course, you mentioned COVID being around a lot longer because, of course, technically now in the UK, the first official death from COVID is 2 days before the first official case of COVID was reported within the UK. So I guess certainly on that point of trying to find the origins of it and trying to understand more, and indeed the WHO have made the point that understanding the origins of this pandemic is going to be crucial to preventing future pandemics. Now, of course, we've talked a lot about China and the fact that obviously the US are pushing now for this investigation, but the Chinese government have been accused in previous investigations of not supplying information and not having the structures in place to be able to do that. Do you think that could be a problem with this investigation, or do you think intelligence will find a way to get around that? Enoch, come to you first very quickly.
Yeah, it's absolutely be a problem. I think that's always an issue from the very beginning of this pandemic. The issue has been that China won't give us access to rigorous knowledge. They're going to try to hide aspects of what's going on. So all I can hope is that Joe Biden. I mean, to the degree that I trust any politician, I trust that Joe Biden he knows more about his ability to access China than I do. So I hope they have the full tools they need to investigate this. I just doubt it's going to get anywhere useful the Chinese government in the way.
And I guess this is coming to you now. I guess, is there more potential political embarrassment, more potential political consequences if it's found that the virus came from a lab, even if inadvertent and accidental, rather than from natural origins?
not only embarrassing, but I think possibly catastrophic for China's future on sort of the international playing field. I think it would be a major advantage to the United States if that was found to be true, because that would lead, I think, to waves of divestment from China, an ending of contracts abroad for Chinese companies, sweeping sanctions, surely. So it's incredibly important for China that it's found not to be conclusive at the very least, or not to be true that it originated in a lab. And I think on your question about data and how the Chinese government would provide it, I think that there'll still be sneaky about it, as the Chinese government typically is about international investigations. Don't forget there's still the Uyghur issue going on in Xinjiang, and they've been very secretive about that. And I don't see why they'll be suddenly very open about this investigation that could possibly set them back at least a few decades compared to the US.
Well, I think certainly it will be interesting where the investigation leads to, and of course the political fallout from this, particularly in this sort of rumored potential new Cold War between the US and China as well. A lot of political consequences from this, so certainly something to continue to see. We're going on now to our last story, and I guess in the subject of great power, controversy, and conflict. This obviously in Belarus last week. So Belarus was accused of piracy by some actors within the EU and the US last week, following the arrest of a dissident journalist, Roman Protasevich, and his girlfriend, Sofia Sapega. Now, they were on a Ryanair flight that was flying from Athens up to the Lithuanian capital, Vilnius. And now they were argued, or the plane was basically told to, or international law states that planes should be able to fly freely across countries, that commercial aviation should not be interrupted. The Belarusian authorities said that they were responding to a bomb threat on the plane, and Belarusian fighter jets diverted the plane to Minsk airport. On it arrested Protasevich and his girlfriend, who were then allegedly forced into a confession by the Belarusian security services. They're both in jail at the moment, awaiting charges. It's feared by some that they are potentially facing terror charges, which in Belarus is punishable by death. Now, of course, it's followed a year of protests within Belarus. Of course, Alexander Lukashenko, the last dictator within Europe, has had significant controversies concerning the election that took place last year. Many believe that the now exiled opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya won that election legitimately. And of course, Lukashenko serves as a significant ally to Vladimir Putin. And indeed, last week, Lukashenko and Putin were meeting in Sochi, where this matter was discussed. And indeed, Russia banned Austrian Airlines and Air France planes flying into Russia, owing to the fact that they stopped their planes flying through Belarus, and the Russian air traffic controllers didn't approve the flight maps. So quite a lot of controversy emerging from this, and whether this becomes more of a flashpoint between relations in Russia and the rest, we'll get onto first. But let's start off with the action at first. It has been, some have accused this as international piracy, potential state terror. Enoch, do you believe that the response to this so far has been sufficient? Enoch, you're on mute.
Oh no. I'll redo the whole bit then. No, no, you cannot let a state out like this. It's absolutely unacceptable that a state on the edge of the EU, right next to NATO, wouldn't act like this toward. It's absolutely unthinkable. And I mean, obviously, it's always very difficult when you're sort of talking about how to discipline states to break the rules, because eventually people start saying, "Oh, you're talking about military action." But the level of sanctions put against Belarus, I think it's been over the past year, we've sort of seen the rest of the world go AWOL on dealing with the situation there. But Lukashenko, I mean, even if he won the election, the way he's acted in response has absolutely not been democratic. It's proven unworthy of the word democracy, and the rest of the world sort of let it happen. And what we're doing now is giving license to every two-bit dictator out there who thinks they can kidnap a plane and kill a dissident they want, and it's unacceptable.
Well, it's important to say two things. Firstly, that the dissident has been arrested. He is not. He has not died at this moment.
Yes.
It is feared that he may be put on a charge that could lead to him receiving the death penalty. And in terms of the sanctions that have been imposed, just to clarify them a bit further, the UK and the EU banned their planes flying through Belarusian airspace and have also banned Belarusian airlines and Belarusian planes from flying into their countries. Odysseus, I guess the same question. How significant sanctions are these? Could they potentially go further?
I don't think they go far enough, honestly. But there's not much that Western powers can do in this case. I mean, I think they're right to respond with the sanctions on the air borders with Belarus, even though the leader of the Belarusian sort of opposition, Tikhanovskaya, has called, while she's leading her government in exile, for these borders to be reopened for Belarusian citizens. So even Tikhanovskaya isn't fully behind these measures. Perhaps they're a bit exclude. I mean, I think that they could go further with economic sanctions and much more significant political sanctions. But I think the embarrassment is already wide-reaching enough for Belarus on the international scene, and they obviously don't really seem to care about that. And I have to echo what Enoch said, that we cannot allow any sort of dictator to do this. The plane was so close to Vilnius anyways, it was turned back really at the last moment. And you do mention, it did. The plane did take off from Athens, and this was a major political issue here. They were talking on the panel shows, politicians were talking late into the night about this issue, really before it became sort of an international problem. And there is at least one, I guess, silver lining or something that was a bit funny about it. Some Greek guy was going to end up in Belarus anyways, but just for some reason would transfer from Vilnius. As they were arresting the dissidents, just stepped off and just left. He just left in Minsk, which I thought was brilliant, because the Greek TV interviewed him and they say, why are you in Minsk now? He's like, oh well, I needed to see my wife here, and I thought I might as well just get off the plane.
I feel from the point
which
of
I
airport
thought was just brilliant, very typical.
I feel from the point of airport security, I feel an absolute number. With family having previously worked in aviation, I can understand a few of the stresses right now.
He's just lost his luggage on that plane, hasn't he? They definitely didn't open that.
Yeah, no, he just walked off. He's like, yeah, all right, I'm going home now. Gonna see the wife. They're arresting dissidents on my flight. It's just insane. The whole situation is mind-boggling. But on a serious note, I think Belarus is an important buffer for Europe between really the aggressive sort of Russian military policy and more sort of peaceable measures in NATO. And I think what's really much more concerning is how closer Lukashenko and Putin have got over the past year. But in terms of this episode's significance, I don't think it's ultimately going to prove that significant. We saw what happened last year, massive protests, government in exile, and still nothing really substantial. So honestly, I'll be a bit of a pessimist here and say that there's probably not much going to come out of this in a couple of months.
Well, let's follow on from that very quickly, because, of course, Belarus and Russia indeed are so close that they do actually have a treaty signed in 1996, effectively dedicating both countries to a union with each other. That's the nature of their relationship. And, of course, given the increased situation with Ukraine, of course, increasingly moving towards the West, we know that in the Donbass, Russia have been sending Russian passports to citizens there. So I guess as a final question very quickly, Enoch, is Belarus, I guess, a new flashpoint in relations with Russia and the West?
My first instinct is to say no. I simply don't believe that. I don't believe there's a political will left in places like England, places like Germany, to stand with Russia anymore. I don't see there any. Maybe Joe Biden will lead us into a glorious new, glorious new age, into a new sort of new age of standing up against Russian aggression again. But I don't think it's going to. I don't think there's the will is out. The fight's out in Europe. That's what I think for now. So if the flashpoint is anywhere, it's not going to be Belarus and not going to be anytime soon.
Okay, and Odysseus?
Yeah, I think that definitely for the European Union and for NATO, it's going to be a flashpoint, but not internationally. You saw how strong the European response was and how how passionately the points were put by Charles Michel and Ursula von der Leyen about this whole episode. And I think that now the EU is taking foreign policy a bit more seriously, with Turkey, for example, and now with Belarus. And it's important strategically, and they're going to have to deal with it. The EU is going to have to deal with this, whereas the US can sort of remain in the background a little bit. But I don't think this is going to be another Ukraine. But on just a quick point on this treaty that you mentioned last year, when the protests were getting out of hand for Lukashenko, when he was being booed off stage by coal miners, and NATO forces were making some movements in response to Russian movements. Russia promised that they would send tanks to Belarus in accordance to this treaty, and luckily, I don't think they did. But the Kremlin put out a very strong statement on that, and I think it still shows that Russia and Belarus are pretty tied.
Well, I think it will certainly be again. The story's clearly not over, and of course, we'll be interested to see what happens to Roman Protasevich and Sofia Sapega as well. But certainly a lot of controversy from this story, and certainly a lot of controversial topics discussed on today's show. But that is the end now. Thank you so much for watching today. Thank you so much to my guests, to Enoch and to Odysseus, for coming on. Insight will be taking a break next week. Again, if you do have any issues with that, please blame Work Central timetabling for that. But we'll be back, hopefully, in the studio in 2 weeks' time for our Pride Week special. But thanks very much for tuning in, and I hope to see you again soon.